Hey everyone, it's Necromancer 1040 here. I know it's been a while since I've uploaded something, but to be honest, I've been incredibly busy. But yeah, sorry for that. But I mean, I'm glad to say I've finally been able to dedicate these past few days to make a video that I wanted to get out to you guys and just everyone. So yeah, well, don't mind the cars. I know you probably heard them, or maybe not, thankfully. But I just live behind a very busy street. But you guys know that already. But without any further ado, this video is the useful cards against the Yu-Gi-Oh meta. So this is primarily for the meta that is gearing up right after this most recent ban list in 2020. So yeah, without any further ado, let's get into the cards I think will be useful for this particular meta format. So the first one that I could think right off the bat is Cursed Seal of the Forbidden Spell. Cursed Seal of the Forbidden Spell, I feel, has been a very underrated card for a long time. Um, it's actually a really old card that hasn't seen much play, and I still don't see too many people using it. It's very great for what it does, because I mean it negates the activation of a spell, which everyone uses spells and primarily uses spells as opposed to traps. Um, and it restricts the activation of the same spell once you negate that spell. So that's great for basically shutting down a lot of spells that people use at 3 copies, like the upcoming Lightning Storm. That's going to be very effective against Lightning Storm when that hits. It can also stop things like Called by the Grave, so they can't stop your hand trap plays after that. Or if someone wants to really wreck your back row, like Lightning Storm, you can stop stuff like Twin Twisters, or even things like Galaxy Cyclone. Just basically any common 3 of spell card takes a huge hit to this card, or will buy this card. And it has the greatest thing about this card is it's also a speed spell 3, so it's a counter trap. Um, it's hard to negate. I mean, if you have another trap card, that's the only real thing that can negate and stop it. So yeah, it just really sticks it to your opponent. It just really negates that one spell and prevents them from using those same spells that the deck's probably going to be reliant upon. So if it's something like a Salamandrate spell, like, or a field spell that your opponent really needs to kick off their plays, that really shuts it down. But if you don't really want to use Curse Seal of the Forbidden Spell, um, you can use something like a Dark Bribe. Dark Bribe is an alternative. I personally liked it. I've used it a lot. It can negate spells and traps, so it's it's very uh, broad use. It can do 2 things as opposed to what Curse Seal of the Forbidden Spell can do. It's also a counter trap, so it's hard to negate. It's hard to negate it. Actually, Dark Bribe can stop Curse Seal of the Forbidden Spell if you're in a mirror match like that. So that's an upside. The downside is that Dark Bribe does allow your opponent to draw a card, and that may be a card that decides ultimately the fate of the duel, or really puts your opponent in a good position. But use Dark Bribe strategically only if you need to. It's really a card you want to hold back and use it for very key and strategic plays. Curse Seal of the Forbidden Spell is you don't have to use it as effectively. And the one thing about Curse Seal of the Forbidden Spell, you do have to discard 1 card as a cost for it. Dark Bribe doesn't really have a cost. Dark Bribe just allows your opponent to draw 1. So that's kind of the disparity between the two. So yeah, the next card I want to also highlight is Droll and Lockbird. Um, Droll and Lockbird prevents a lot of searching. So if you don't know what searching is, it's basically adding cards from your deck to your hand, and that's basically 90% of the meta for the longest time, and you could say even modern Yu-Gi-Oh, or within the past decade. So yeah, Droll and Lockbird is basically your closest alternative to Colossus, to Thunder Dragon Colossus. Yeah, rest in peace, Colossus. So if you really want to shut down your opponent in terms of searching things, you can. Salamangreats take a huge hit because of that. Droll and Lockbird really stops them. Uh, and Droll and Lockbird is also a hand trap if you don't know. So it can allow you to interrupt your opponent during their turn as well. And it basically, if the deck relies too much on searching, they basically have to pass their turn, and that just ends their turn pretty much. So other decks that Droll and Lockbird really does shut down is Spirals. And that's really significant because we know Spirals have really been I mean, you've pretty much heard the rumors that Spirals are pretty much taking off and are pretty much going to be almost some people will even say a tier 0 deck, but definitely tier 1. Tier 1 or at very least tier 2. So Droll and Lockbird is really something you want to use. But you also want to use it with caution. If you're going to use 3 copies, just bear in mind that it can be dead once you use it, or if your opponent doesn't search too heavily and can circumvent your strategy with something like Orchists, it may be a dead card. So you may want to side deck Droll and Lockbird for some matches, but for the most part, I can say it's probably better off in your main deck. But use your common sense and use what you think is best. Droll and Lockbird is overall a great card, and I could not recommend it enough. And so it also leads me to the next card on this list, which is Crackdown. Crackdown is a great card. It targets and takes control of your opponent's monster. It functions as an interruption during your opponent's turn because it is a trap card. The one downside of Crackdown is you have to set it down face down first because, I mean, it's a trap card. It inherently has to do that because of its design. But on the flip side, it does allow you to interrupt your opponent. You can cause chains, and you can really sneak in your strategies that way. And it allows you to take a monster from your opponent, which, especially if your opponent dedicates a lot of resources into bringing out that monster, that can really hurt them if they don't have a follow-up play to that. And if they do have a follow-up play, you're basically forcing them to respond to that, to your Crackdown. And so Crackdown really just keeps the monster on your field unless Crackdown leaves the field. So yeah, I mean, Crackdown is a great usage, or is a great use of advantage for your deck. Especially, like I said, it just takes advantage away from your opponent, and it gives you the advantage that your opponent really worked hard to put onto their field. So you can take a monster and use it for a link play or any sort of extra deck play, and whatever you want it to be. And but if you don't really want to use Crackdown, another alternative to Crackdown would be Mind Control. Mind Control is not a trap; it's a spell card. So it functions a lot like Crackdown. It targets and then takes control of a monster that your opponent controls. It basically makes it your own. So, but the downside to Mind Control is it doesn't allow you to keep that monster. Because it only allows you to keep that monster until the end of the turn. It's not like Crackdown where it stays on the field, and so long as Crackdown is on the field, you get to keep that monster. So that is a potential downside to it. Mind Control can't allow you to interrupt your opponent during their turn because it's not really a quick play and it's a spell card. Another potential downside would be it's limited to 2 copies as opposed to Crackdown. You can use 3 copies of Crackdown. So, but on the flip side too, Mind Control is a spell, so you can activate it a lot more easily and readily, and you can just take away something your opponent has on the field, and it really does force responses from your opponent if they really can't afford to lose a monster, much like Crackdown. So those are the positives, and along with the downsides and the parallels between Crackdown and Mind Control. But Mind Control it's a phenomenal card. There's a reason why it's limited to 2 now, and it's really worth using in your deck. But with that brings me to another set of cards that I really wanted to talk about, and I think are really useful. They've been useful in the past too, as well. And one of them is Winged Dragon of Ra Sphere mode. So Winged Dragon of Ra Sphere mode, it requires 3 tributes, either from your side or from your opponent's side. You really don't want to use it from your side typically, um, especially if you've seen what it does in the past. It's primarily used on your opponent. It's mainly used to take down your opponent's side of the field, and basically, if your opponent sets up a whole field where they're putting unbreakable boards and just monsters with crazy protection effects that can't be taken off the field, Winged Dragon of Ra Sphere mode is basically meant to break your opponent's board, and in a lot of cases, it allows you to play. So yeah, all that effort that your opponent put into trying to lock you out of the game, well, now it's gone because you tributed 3 of their monsters on their side of the field, and you just put this almost useless monster on their side of the field. The one downside is you do give them 1 monster on their side of the field, but you ultimately have taken 3 monsters from their side of the field. So that, in my opinion, that's more than worth it. Um, it also, like I said before, it circumvents protection effects, and tributes cannot be negated so far in terms of what the meta commonly uses. I mean, yes, there are things like Mask of Restrict that prevents tributes, but Mask of Restrict hasn't seen a lot of play in quite a while, so I mean, that's not something you really need to look too much for. I mean, you can easily destroy it with Twin Twisters or Galaxy Cyclone, something like that. So Winged Dragon of Ra is a really good contender for this list, I would say. But if you do not want to use Winged Dragon of Ra Sphere mode, another alternative, and a really good alternative, I would say, is Nibiru. So Nibiru can tribute tons of monsters from your opponent's side of the field. You can potentially tribute away up to 5 monsters from your opponent's side of the field. So the only thing your opponent needs to do is special summon more than 4 times or summon 4 monsters on their more than 4 monsters to their side of the field for you to activate Nibiru's effect. So Nibiru basically takes away a bunch of your monsters on the field, it tributes on your opponent's side of the field, and it tributes them, and it basically summons a huge token to their side of the field that is the combined attack strength of all those monsters that were tributed. So you may be saying, well, why would you want to give your opponent a huge attack point token monster? Well, that's really designed to basically get rid of a lot of monsters that you can't deal with. And now with a bunch of destruction effects that a lot of decks have, you can easily deal with that token. So that's probably why you want to use Nibiru. The potential downsides to Nibiru is also that it's not it's not like Winged Dragon of Ra Sphere mode where it's mainly a cost for its summon. It's almost in a way an effect, so it can be negated by things like Dawn Dragster, and it can be negated by Borreload Savage and Apollosa, and all sorts of negation effects. And so that is the downside to Nibiru. But ultimately, Nibiru, I would say, is a really strong contender, despite its downsides. I mean, there's a reason why it's used so much in the meta, and it's I mean it's why it's at its current price point. It's not too expensive, but it is worth something. So yeah, but other cards I would like to point out also that I should have mentioned more in the beginning are the solemn cards, because they really relate to the whole negation cards. Really, any of the solemn cards are pretty viable, well, except solemn scolding. Um, that's kind of hard to use because mainly because of its restrictions. But stuff like Solemn Warning, Solemn Judgment, and Solemn Strike primarily, those are the cards that you really want to use, because those cards can just outright negate things, and they can things like Solemn Strike can really deal with the upcoming new card Dragoon of Red Eyes. So yeah. Dragoon of Red Eyes, if you guys don't know, it's this crazy fusion monster that can negate uh, pretty much anything that your opponent does, and it powers itself up, and you can potentially get that thing up to 4,000 attack points. So it's a pretty scary monster, and if you don't want to deal with it, you can ultimately get rid of it with one of the solemn cards, because it can't negate a counter trap. So because of the speed spell limitations, you do have a leg up if you use the solemn cards. And you can really deal with Dragoon of Red Eyes with most of the other cards I've mentioned on this list. And so, yeah, I guess in a way you could say this is kind of how to deal with Dragoon of Red Eyes, almost in a sense. But with that, yeah, that pretty much wraps up the video. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. I certainly did. Because it's kind of interesting to look at how the meta forms, and it's I really like delving into the ideas of how to pick apart the meta almost, and just look at its weaknesses and see what that kind of reveals about the cards in this format. So yeah, thank you so much for watching, and if you really want to help support my content in the future, you can do so by supporting me on Patreon. Patreon really is the best way to help me put out videos like this. It helps me get more more higher quality content, and you're basically investing in my capabilities of pushing out content on a more regular basis to you guys. And yeah, it really does make all the difference, along with your views and everything. That's what counts the most, your views. But if you really do want to help, that's a way you can. It's nothing that you have to do, obviously. It's solely if you want to. But with that, that pretty much wraps up the video, and thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you in the next video. Alright, take it easy.